The night was colder than usual. In the narrow alleys of Old Town, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery mixed with the sharp, metallic scent of raw meat. Dogs of the neighborhood often gathered outside the butcher's shop, their tails wagging in hope, their eyes gleaming with trust. But that night, something was different. A young stray dog named Rusty dragged himself into the alley, his paws trembling, his breath weak. His eyes were glassy with pain. He collapsed right in front of the shop, his stomach swollen. The other dogs rushed to him, tails no longer wagging, but stiff with fear. A German shepherd named Max, known for his sharp mind and unshakable sense of justice, bent down to sniff Rusty. His nose caught it immediately, the scent of spoiled, rotting meat inside the young dog's belly. Rusty whimpered softly, his voice fading. Meat. From the butcher. It was poisoned, and with a final sigh, the alley grew silent. Max stood frozen, his ears pinned back, his chest heaving. He had always believed humans could be trusted, that their shops were safe, that their hands were meant to feed, not to harm. But tonight, he saw betrayal. The butcher's door creaked open. A heavy figure stepped out, wiping blood from his hands onto a dirty apron. His eyes darted at the lifeless Rusty, then quickly away. He muttered under his breath and tossed a sack into the shadows. From the torn corner of the sack, Max saw it. Green, slimy pieces of meat crawling with flies. The butcher had been hiding spoiled meat. He had been selling death. Max's heart thundered in his chest. Around him the other dogs whimpered, their eyes turning to him for guidance. And in that moment, Max made a silent vow. This will not be buried in the dark. If justice exists in this town, I will drag the truth into the light. For the first time in history, a German shepherd would walk into a courtroom, not as evidence, not as a guard, but as a lawyer. The night after Rusty's death, the neighborhood was restless. Every alley, every corner, every rooftop echoed with whispers. Dogs growling in hushed voices, tails stiff, ears twitching with anger. They gathered at the old oak tree in the park, a place where disputes were usually settled with nothing more than a bark or two. But this time was different. This time, a life had been taken. A scarred old bulldog named Brutus raised his voice, his deep growl shaking the silence. The butcher has poisoned us. Rusty was not the first, and he won't be the last if we stay silent. Murmurs spread like wildfire. A beagle cried out, "My brother got sick last week after eating scraps from his shop." Another muttered, "And my pups, they vomited for days." The anger swelled until it was no longer whispers but a storm of growls, barks, and furious howls. Max, the German shepherd, stood in the center of the pack. His sharp amber eyes scanned each face, each broken spirit. He lifted his head high, and when he spoke, his voice carried like a command. Enough. We cannot let fear chain us. Rusty deserves justice. Every sick pup deserves justice. And justice will not come from howling in the dark. We must face him where lies are stripped bare, in the court. The crowd fell silent, stunned. Dogs had never dared to challenge humans in their own halls of judgment. But Max's words carried a force they could not deny. "But who will speak for us?" asked a timid terrier. "The judge won't listen to barking and growling." Max's tail rose high, a symbol of resolve. "I will. I will speak their language. I will argue our case. I will stand in front of the judge, not as a guard dog, not as evidence, but as the voice of the voiceless." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Brutus squinted at him. "You mean to stand in the human court? As a lawyer?" Max's deep bark was steady as stone. "Yes. The butcher thinks he can hide his crime, but I will expose him. I swear it on Rusty's memory." And that night, under the moonlight, dozens of dogs raised their heads and howled together. It was not a cry of despair, but a cry of defiance. The trial of the century was about to begin. The dogs versus the butcher. The courthouse stood like a fortress at the heart of the city, its tall stone columns reaching into the sky, its heavy wooden doors carved with scales of justice. Humans passed through its gates every day, carrying their grievances, their lies, and their truths. But never before had it seen what was about to happen. On the morning of the hearing, whispers filled the streets. Dogs of every breed had gathered along the sidewalks, their tails wagging nervously, their eyes fixed on one figure striding with purpose. Max, the German shepherd. He wore no robe, carried no briefcase, but his presence carried a gravity stronger than any lawyer's suit. Around his neck hung a single leather collar, and in his jaws he carried a stack of papers, evidence collected through the night. A Labrador barked as he passed. "Max, the court won't accept a dog." Max paused, his eyes steady. "They'll have no choice. Truth has no species." Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The judge, an aging man with stern eyes and silver hair, shuffled his papers, clearly irritated by the noise outside. Beside him sat clerks, shuffling documents, unprepared for the storm about to break through their doors. The butcher was already there. His thick arms were crossed, his apron gone, but the smell of blood still clung to him. His lips curled into a mocking smile as the doors creaked open. And then Max walked in. Gasps erupted across the courtroom. Journalists dropped their pens. Men rose from their seats. Some laughed, others whispered in disbelief. The judge slammed his gavel. "Silence. Who dares bring a dog into my courtroom?" Max walked calmly to the center of the room. He dropped the stack of papers at the defense table, then looked directly at the judge. His voice was steady, clear, and unmistakably human in its tone, translated not by words, but by the conviction in his eyes and the growl beneath them. "I am Max," he said firmly, "and I stand as counsel for the victims, the dogs poisoned by this man's meat." The courtroom froze. No one moved. No one even breathed. The butcher's mocking smile faltered, twisting into unease. The judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Dog claims to be counsel?" Max held his ground. "Not just a dog, a witness, a protector, a seeker of truth. You may see fur, but I bring evidence, logic, and a voice for those who cannot speak your language. Let me prove it. Give me one chance." The judge's gavel hung in the air, his knuckles tight around it. Finally, he set it down slowly. "This court will allow a hearing, but only because justice demands every voice be heard, no matter how impossible." Murmurs swept through the hall. Max had done it. Against every odd, against every stare of disbelief, he had walked into the halls of human justice and been allowed to stand. The butcher's face darkened, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. For the first time, he realized this was no ordinary German shepherd. This was a lawyer born of loyalty, pain, and unshakable will. And the trial had just begun. The gavel struck once more, echoing through the courtroom like a thunderclap. "Bring forth the accused," the judge ordered. The butcher rose from his seat with a heavy grunt. His thick fingers gripped the edge of the table as he leaned forward, glaring at Max with a sneer. "So this is what the world's come to? A mutt in the courtroom barking nonsense?" A ripple of laughter spread among a few spectators, but Max didn't flinch. His amber eyes locked onto the butcher's, steady as steel. The judge cleared his throat. "Butcher, you are accused of selling spoiled and contaminated meat, causing the sickness and death of several animals. How do you plead?" The butcher straightened his back, puffing out his chest. "Not guilty. These animals, stray dogs, scavengers, they eat trash, filth from the streets. If they fall sick, that's their nature, not my business. I sell good meat. Always have, always will." The courtroom murmured with unease. Max's ears twitched, his body tense, but he waited. The judge turned to Max. "Counsel, the defendant denies all accusations. Do you have evidence?" Max padded forward, nudging the stack of papers with his nose. A clerk picked them up reluctantly, his hands shaking as though he half feared the touch of evidence delivered by a dog. Inside were photographs, green, slimy chunks of beef pulled from the butcher's trash, marked with dates and times, reports from veterinarians who had examined dogs sickened by the same meat. even testimonies written by humans who had bought rancid cuts and fallen ill themselves, too embarrassed until now to speak up. Gasps filled the room as the judge flipped through the evidence. His eyes grew darker with each page, but the butcher leaned forward, his voice loud and dripping with confidence. Lies, all lies. Dogs cannot testify. Dogs cannot prove anything. And these so-called reports? Probably forged, probably planted by some rival shopkeeper trying to ruin me. This court is a place for men, not animals. The words struck like daggers, but Max did not lower his head. Instead, he stepped closer to the bench, his voice steady and deep. Your Honor, the truth does not care if it comes from a man or a dog. Rusty's death was not an accident. The meat we found was poison. If the butcher denies it, let us call witnesses. Let the victims speak through their scars. The judge studied Max in silence, then nodded once. Very well. This court will hear witnesses. But be warned, Shepherd. One false step, and this trial will end in ruin. Max's tail flicked once. A soldier's salute. I understand. Justice demands nothing less. The butcher smirked, but his eyes betrayed the faintest flicker of worry. For the first time, his denial had not been enough. The courtroom no longer laughed. They listened. And Max had won the right to bring his witnesses into the light. The courtroom reconvened after a short recess. The tension in the air was heavy, like a storm waiting to break. Outside, a sea of dogs pressed against the courthouse gates, tails stiff, eyes burning with anticipation. Inside, the butcher sat hunched, his arms crossed, his lips curling into a mocking grin. The judge raised his gavel. Counsel Max, present your first witness. Max's tail flicked once. He turned toward the heavy wooden doors, and with a sharp bark, he summoned him. The doors creaked open, and in limped a frail old hound named Shadow. His coat was patchy, his ribs showing, and his eyes clouded with fatigue. Each step was slow, labored. Murmurs filled the courtroom. The sight of his weakened body stirred both pity and unease. The clerk swore him in, though his hands trembled as if doubting the ritual itself. Do you swear to tell the truth, as best as you can? Shadow lifted his graying muzzle and let out a low bark that echoed with pain. It was not just a bark, it was testimony written in scars. Max stepped forward, his voice calm but heavy with emotion. Shadow, tell the court what happened the night you bought meat from the butcher. The old hound's voice was raspy, broken. I was hungry, desperate. The butcher gave me scraps from his bin, said it was fresh. I trusted him. I ate. He paused, his legs shaking beneath him. Hours later, fire burned in my stomach. My body twisted. I thought I was dying. And then I saw others, pups, strays, even house dogs, suffering the same. We realized it all came from the same man. From him. Shadow raised his muzzle, his clouded eyes fixing on the butcher. You sold us poison. The courtroom gasped. Some men shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others shook their heads in disbelief. The butcher slammed his fist on the table, his voice booming. Lies! Dogs eat garbage every day and fall sick. How dare you put this on me? But Shadow didn't flinch. His body trembled, but his voice grew stronger. I may be weak, but I remember the stench, the green flesh, the flies. You knew it was rotten. You sold it anyway. Max's ears stood tall, his voice cutting through the rising noise. Your Honor, this is no wild accusation. Shadow is not alone. Dozens of dogs fell ill after eating from the same shop. We have medical records, consistent symptoms, and samples matching the meat found in the butcher's own bin. The judge frowned, flipping through the stack of reports again. His gaze drifted back to Shadow, who now stood barely able to hold himself upright. For a long moment, silence reigned. Then the judge spoke softly. Shadow, you may rest. The old hound bowed his head and limped away, each step echoing like a drumbeat of truth. Max turned his gaze back to the butcher, his amber eyes gleaming. This is only the beginning. For every denial you spit, there are voices ready to rise against you. Voices that will not be silenced. For the first time, the butcher's grin faded. His jaw clenched and sweat glistened on his brow. The courtroom could sense it. This was no longer a joke, no longer a spectacle. This was justice clawing its way into the light. The judge leaned forward, his voice steady. The defense may cross-examine. The butcher rose slowly, pushing back his chair with a screech that cut through the silence. His thick boots thudded against the floor as he approached the witness stand where Shadow was still seated, too weak to move quickly. A twisted smile spread across the butcher's face. "So, old mutt, you claim I poisoned you?" Shadow tried to lift his head, but his body sagged. His voice came out weak. "Yes. Your scraps. They burned me inside. The butcher cut him off with a booming laugh. "Or maybe it was the garbage you licked from the street. Maybe it was the rotten carcass you dragged from the alley last week. Dogs eat filth every day. Isn't that true?" Shadow's ears drooped, his tail tucked. He stammered, I... The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. A few humans even nodded, their doubt growing. The butcher leaned closer, his voice dripping with venom. "You're a stray, a beggar. You'd eat anything to survive. Isn't that the truth? So how can you be sure it was my meat? You can't. You're nothing but a sick old hound blaming your misery on an honest man." Shadow's eyes clouded with shame. His body trembled. For a moment it looked as if the butcher had broken him completely. The butcher smirked, turning toward the judge. "No further questions. The witness is unreliable." Max's hackles rose. He strode forward, his paws firm against the polished wooden floor. His voice thundered through the chamber. "Objection!" The judge's gavel slammed. "Sustained. Counsel Max, you may redirect." Max stepped to Shadow's side, lowering his head gently until his amber eyes met the old hound's tired gaze. His voice softened. "Shadow, remember Rusty. Remember the pups. This is not just about you. Speak your truth. The court will listen." Tears welled in Shadow's clouded eyes. He raised his head, summoning strength from somewhere deep inside. "I may be old, but I know what I ate. It was not garbage, not scraps from the street. It was meat handed to me by that man. I trusted him. We all did, and he betrayed that trust." The courtroom fell silent. Max turned back to the judge, his voice clear as steel. "Your Honor, the butcher calls Shadow unreliable because he is old, because he is poor, because he is desperate. But those are the very reasons he could never afford to lie. He speaks with the weight of truth carved by suffering." The judge's gaze hardened on the butcher. "Point taken." The butcher clenched his fists, his smirk gone. Sweat dripped down his temple. For the first time, his tricks had failed to silence the truth. Max stood tall, his voice echoing with authority. "This is what the butcher fears, that even the weakest voice, once heard, can shatter the strongest lie." The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. The butcher shifted uneasily in his chair, his eyes darting toward the heavy doors. He expected another frail hound, another weak voice he could crush with sneers and laughter. But when the doors creaked open this time, the entire room fell silent. A small figure padded in, thin legs trembling, ears too large for his head, eyes wide and fragile. It was Bolt, a young pup barely old enough to leave his mother's side. His steps were hesitant, each one echoing louder than the butcher's footsteps ever had. Gasps spread across the gallery. Even the clerk, hardened by years of trials, fumbled with his oath as the pup climbed into the witness stand. Max approached him slowly, his posture gentle, protective. "Bolt," he said softly, "tell the court what happened the night you ate from the butcher's scraps." The pup's tiny voice quivered, barely louder than a whisper. "I was so hungry. My belly hurt for days. Then I smelled meat outside his shop. It smelled funny, but I was starving. I ate it." Bolt's little body shook. His eyes welled with tears as memories flooded back. "Hours later, fire was in my stomach. I cried all night. My brothers licked my face, but I couldn't move. I thought I was going to die." The courtroom was dead silent. Men shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One juror pressed his hand against his mouth, fighting emotion. Bolt's voice cracked, trembling as he looked at the judge. Why would he give us meat if he knew it was bad? Why would a man do that? The words struck deeper than any evidence. Even the judge's stern face faltered, his jaw tightening as he glanced at the butcher. The butcher tried to stand, to shout, but his voice caught in his throat. For once, he found no words, no laughter to hide behind. Max stepped forward, his tone steady but carrying the weight of every suffering voice. Your Honor, truth is not only found in reports and numbers, it is found in the eyes of the innocent. This pup nearly lost his life. Rusty did. And how many more before we stop calling it accident and start calling it crime? Bolt's tail tucked tightly between his legs as he whispered one last time. I just wanted food, not pain. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. For a brief moment, even the scribbling of journalists ceased. No one could look at the pup without feeling the heavy sting of guilt and shame. The judge exhaled slowly, his voice quieter than before. Let the record show. This court has heard enough to prove suffering was real, undeniable, and caused by contaminated meat. Max bowed his head toward Bolt, his voice gentle. You have spoken bravely today, little one. Rusty would be proud. Bolt nodded faintly, his small body trembling as he left the stand. A hush followed him, the kind of hush that comes only after hearts have been shattered. And in that silence, the butcher's empire of denial began to crumble. The courtroom was restless now. Whispers buzzed like angry bees. The pup's trembling words still lingered in the air, and every eye burned holes into the butcher's heavy frame. The judge's voice rang out, steady but grim. Counsel Max, do you have further evidence? Max's amber eyes glinted with a sharp, almost predatory focus. His tail flicked once and he padded to the evidence table. With a single bark, he signaled. The side doors opened and in marched two police officers. Between them, they carried a heavy crate. The room stirred as the crate thudded onto the floor. Its wooden slats leaked a foul, sickly odor that twisted stomachs and wrinkled noses. The butcher's face paled. Sweat dripped down his forehead. The judge frowned. What is this? Max's voice was calm, but beneath it rumbled the growl of justice. Your Honor, during the recess, I requested the authorities search the butcher's storeroom. What they found was this? One of the officers pried the crate open. Inside lay piles of meat, green, slimy, riddled with maggots. The stench filled the courtroom, forcing some spectators to cover their mouths in disgust. A collective gasp rippled across the gallery. Max stepped closer, his gaze never leaving the butcher. This is no accident. This is no mistake. The butcher has been storing spoiled meat for weeks, hiding it from inspection, selling it to the desperate, the poor, the voiceless, and when the weakest fell ill, he laughed it away as trash-eating strays. The butcher leapt to his feet, his voice cracking with rage. Lies! That crate was planted. Dogs! Dogs can't investigate. This is a trick. But Max did not flinch. His voice sharpened. Then explain, butcher, why your fingerprints are all over the lids. Explain why the dates on the packaging match the very days Shadow and Bolt fell ill. Explain why Rusty died the same night you tossed this filth into the alley. The butcher's mouth opened, but no words came. His lips trembled. His eyes darted desperately around the room, searching for an ally, but found none. The judge slammed his gavel, his voice thunderous. Order in this court! Silence fell again. Max lowered his head, his gaze piercing straight through the butcher's mask of denial. You can smear the old. You can mock the weak. You can sneer at a pup. But the truth, butcher, the truth is rotting in your own hands. The spectators erupted. Gasps, shouts, murmurs. Some clapped, some growled. The gallery of dogs outside howled in unison, their voices seeping through the courthouse windows like a wave of defiance. The butcher collapsed back into his chair, his face pale, his breath ragged. His lies lay in pieces, shattered by the stench of his own crime. And Max, calm, relentless, unshaken, stood taller than ever before. The courtroom was silent, heavy with the stench of truth laid bare. The butcher sat slumped in his chair, sweat dripping down his brow, his lips muttering fragments of excuses that no one cared to hear. The judge leaned back, his face carved in stone, eyes fixed on the crate of rotting meat. His gavel rested at his fingertips, but the silence that stretched before him was louder than thunder. At last, he spoke. This court has heard the testimonies of the weak and the innocent. It has seen the scars of betrayal etched into the bodies of those who trusted. It has smelled the evidence with its own breath, and it cannot, will not, turn away. He turned his gaze to the butcher, his voice cutting like a blade. You, a man trusted to feed, chose instead to poison. You clothed your greed in the guise of business. You profited from suffering. You silenced the hungry with sickness. And when their voices rose, you laughed. The butcher tried to stand, but his legs shook. His words stumbled from his lips. They're just animals. The judge's gavel slammed down, the sound exploding like cannon fire. Silence! Animals, yes, but beings with breath, with trust, with innocence. And today, they have spoken louder than any human witness. Today, a German shepherd stood before this court. Not as a guard, not as a servant, but as a lawyer. And he has reminded us all that justice does not wear one face. The courtroom stirred, murmurs rising. Some wiped their eyes, others sat frozen in awe. The judge raised his gavel once more. This court finds the defendant. He paused, his words hanging like a sword in the air. Nes, guilty of knowingly distributing spoiled and contaminated meat. Guilty of cruelty. Guilty of betrayal. Of trust. The butcher collapsed into his seat, his head dropping into his hands. The judge's voice rang out like a bell. By the power vested in this court, you are hereby stripped of your license, fined and sentenced to years behind bars. May the silence of your cell remind you of every voice you tried to silence. The gavel struck 3 times, final, unyielding. And then the sound began. From outside, through the walls, came the first howl, then another, then dozens, then hundreds, a chorus of dogs, voices blending into one thunderous cry of triumph and release. Inside, Max stood motionless, his head bowed, not in defeat, but in solemn respect for Rusty, for Bolt, for Shadow, for every victim whose suffering had brought them here. The judge looked at him with something rare in his eyes. Respect. This court owes you, Max, more than words can say. For the first time, Max allowed himself a deep breath. His duty was not yet finished, but justice had been served. When the trial ended, the courthouse doors swung open, and the flood of dogs outside surged forward. Not in chaos, but in reverence. They surrounded Max as he stepped into the sunlight, their eyes shining, their tails wagging low in respect. Brutus, the scarred bulldog, barked proudly. You did it, Max. You gave us a voice where we had none. The old hound Shadow hobbled forward, his body weak but his spirit lighter than it had been in years. He touched his nose gently to Max's shoulder. You carried my truth when I could not. For that, I thank you. And then little Bolt, the pup, trotted up with hesitant steps. His eyes still carried the memory of pain, but now they gleamed with something brighter. Hope. He pressed his small head against Max's leg. Because of you, I get to grow up. I get to live. Max closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the weight of it all. The sorrow, the struggle, the victory. Rusty's face flashed in his memory. The pup who had taken his last breath outside the butcher's shop. Max lifted his head toward the horizon. The sun was setting, painting the sky with gold and crimson. The trial was over, but his duty was not. There would always be injustice. There would always be cruelty hiding in the shadows. And there must always be someone willing to stand against it. With a slow, deliberate step, Max moved forward through the crowd. The dogs parted, forming a path for him. They didn't cheer loudly now. Instead, they bowed their heads, their silence more powerful than any roar. As he passed, the whispers began. Not of fear, not of doubt, but of legend. Max, the shepherd. Max, the lawyer? Max, the voice of justice. At the edge of the courthouse steps, Max paused. He looked back once. Not at the butcher, not at the humans, but at the dogs who had found hope again. His tail rose high, his amber eyes burned with quiet fire, and then he turned toward the open streets. Rusty's memory walked with him. Bolt's future ran beside him. Shadow's truth gave him strength. And so the German shepherd disappeared into the city, not as a dog, not as a mere guardian, but as a symbol, a reminder that even the voiceless can roar when courage gives them breath. And justice will always find its way to the light.